All right, so this is the second video, and we're still at the first day, and this is George Gaiman. So I'm going to go through my notes here and kind of give you a little rundown of what George had to share at the Rebel Capitalist Live June of 2022. And he talked about the Biden approval rating. It's pretty much the worst rating any president's had. And so there's, I guess it looks like 69 disapprove, 32% approve of the way he's handling his job as president. He talks about debt in the system versus GDP, gross domestic product. It's gone up consistently since for the last few years. Usually there's a rate hike in the cycle by the Fed, and then a recession comes. So basically he was talking about as debt grows in the system, interest rate needs to stay low. And the problem is that they can't really raise the rates over 2.25%, because that would just break a lot of things that they don't want to have broken. And this they're going to just use whatever tools they have. And the only tool that they really have is rates and quantitative easing or tightening. And he thinks they're going to lean on quantitative tightening to bring down prices. And as we've been hearing, unemployment rate needs to go up. Network as a percentage of GDP was 300%. If you think about that for a minute, that is really, really staggering. Fed sees that they might decrease asset prices to bring unemployment rate up. So stock prices and things like that are going to be forced to decline. And I think we're seeing that in the economy currently. And really, asset prices lead the economy if you really look at the historical data, and that's what George Gaiman really does. And he talks a lot about the inverted yield curve, and it indicates a recession every time. And when that happens, basically you have 12 to 24 months, which was a common theme amongst all the speakers. So he thinks that's going to continue. So the growth in the Fed market, growth was happening on the balance sheets of central banks from 2007 since the 1950s. So he talked about the global dollar monetary system. And so this chart kind of indicates that for the last sort of 50-ish years, or even more than that, I guess, since the 1950s really is when it kind of started. It steadily increased. Interest rates kept going up and up and up. And then since 2010, the growth has gone down. We need to get back to a self-sustaining economy. We need a different monetary system, as he says. Planners don't know that that's the problem, and they're going to continue to use the same tools. The end game needs a new system. So, excuse me. That's kind of what he was talking about here. Step two is the biggest opportunity he thinks in the next 10 to 15 years. And right now, as we're sort of starting that 10 to 15 year cycle, really wealth is shelter, food, and energy. So think about those as you're planning here in the near future. Do you have adequate capital reserves, shelter, food, and energy? Solar, I think, is a good option. Having a food supply and shelter in less populated areas is another common thing that people are talking about. So you have to increase supply and decrease demand to solve inflation, of course, and currently the opposite is happening. This is going to probably lead to price controls and stimulus. And he thinks they're going to do that. He thinks they're going to do more stimulus as things get worse. And then that obviously leads to another wave of inflation. And the super cycle of economies. And that's kind of what this, I think this is one of his pictures that talks about those things. You know, we see the central planning starting around, well, really started around 1971 was when the Davos World Economic Forum crowd started to implement their plan. Here's where he was talking about the end game requires a new system. You have two options. Option one is the standard of living goes down, social unrest goes up until society collapses. Complete economic collapse is option two. Obviously, they don't want either of those. Both Australians and Keynesians were wrong. The only solution is a new monetary system, but every huge crisis produces an equally huge opportunity for us as investors out there. So that's why everybody was talking about just having dry powder, keeping some cash. And this is kind of the cycle of what's been happening. You know, kind of the Fed kind of gives the drugs, and then it kind of helps the economy. You know, the drug addict kind of wakes up a little bit, but then he falls, and it gives him more drugs, and then on and on until the guy just doesn't wake up anymore. More and more central planning. Government spends spending as a percentage of GDP has really gone up a lot. Economic distortions increase. Then the standard of living goes down, and are we producing more stuff or less stuff is what we really need to be asking. And obviously that's clear, we're producing less. Super cycle of economies, keeping a lot of cash, like I said, because there will be a big opportunity. Build wealth and thrive. Buy the panic, sell the hysteria. Jim Rogers at 60K was what Jim Rogers said about Bitcoin at 60K. He encourages everybody to have a strong network and community and a tribe. They have a group that they put together. It's a high price point entry fee, but really they've seen a lot of success with it. They're really enjoying their group that they put together. It's Ken McElroy, Jason Hartman, and George Gaiman. And I would love to get to a point where I can also be part of that group. Right now, we're still building. So next cycle, he thinks is 2023 and 2024. Fed could send rates negative. He thinks how to position. Just think about how you might position your portfolio to take advantage of that. If the interest rates go negative, which is really crazy even to think about. And he thinks like you're going to see poor to rich, rich to poor. And it's kind of his outlook. All right. So the next speaker was Ken McElroy, mccompanies.com. Ken Mcelroy is pretty fantastic in terms of what he's been able to build over the years. He and Robert Kiyosaki have teamed up on a number of things. He has built a portfolio of over 10,000 multifamily units. So he buys large multifamily properties with Robert Kiyosaki. He has a property management company, and his goal is to go from 10,000 to 25,000 in 10 years. And he thinks that we're moving towards a renter nation. He indicated that what he sees is that in the next 5-ish years, we could see 50% of the United States population renting homes. Right now, it's not nearly that high. He talked about operational risks, supplies, employees, property taxes, cost of capital, all the things we're faced with right now. Interest rate risk was one of the biggest things that it was part of his conversation. Really, he talked about a deal that he just walked from. They had $1 million hard, and they walked from the deal. It was a $70 million deal. And basically, the reason they had to do that was because of the interest rates. And at 75 basis points of an interest rate hike, all of a sudden his numbers didn't work anymore. And when you're talking about a $70 million deal, a small interest rate fluctuation can dramatically change the numbers on that. So luckily and I was like waiting in suspense. It was like $1 million. You just lost $1 million, man. And then he goes, luckily it was refundable, but then made the point, even if it wasn't refundable, he still would have walked from the deal. That's how skewed the numbers looked even after, what did he see here is even after 50 basis points of an interest rate change, his numbers just didn't work anymore. He said with a 20% value add, the profit goes away quickly with a small interest rate increase. And he just went through a lot of examples about how that happens, showed the numbers. Suffice it to say, that's basically what we're seeing in the market right now, and things are pretty crazy. They had a panel, and they talked about, I thought I had a picture, I guess I don't. It was the Uneducated Economist. He's on YouTube if you want to check him out. He actually, believe it or not, was the one that made George Gaiman pretty popular. He had recommended George's YouTube channel right when he was getting started. And he's actually has a W-2 job with a lumber yard, and he purchases a lot of lumber. I think he's up in Washington State, Seattle area, I believe. Anyway, he has his finger on the pulse of what the building materials market's doing. So it's really interesting if you want to check him out. Then the other people were George Gaiman, Ken McElroy, and Jason Hartman. And they talked about the cost of lumber keeps changing because of the supply and transportation costs, and the time to complete things is pushed because of these shortages. So they talked a lot about so if it, a single family house is getting pushed out 6 months, then all of a sudden buyers need to requalify. And they talked about the demand for the houses is there, but if you lose your job or things become more expensive, inflation is affecting people in a real way. Like, what's their capacity to pay at that point? Slow inventory. So Jason Hartman, I talked about this in the last video, but really does a lot of great analysis, in my opinion, of the compared to what scenario. And I'm constantly looking at percentages compared to what. He does an even better job of digging deeper into that. Said even if the low inventory triples of single family homes, the time on market for an average single family home goes from 10 days to 30 days. And when it's normally 4 months is the amount of supply, not time on market, I'm sorry. The amount of supply right now is about 10 days. If the inventory triples, it goes to 30 days when normal is 4 months supply on the market. And this is directly relevant to what I do because I have a house flipping company. So that was encouraging to hear because I've been concerned about that. We have 3 houses going on the market, and like this week, next week, I'm just wondering if my values are correct, stuff like that. So anyway, super fascinating. All right, next person, Stephen Van Meter. StephenVanMeter.com is where you can look him up. A really interesting guy. He talked about the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, created the current world financial system, which most people don't know. Boomers started outsourcing because they loved consuming. He talks a lot about baby boomers and how we got to the situation we are in because of that. And then because of this, sort of our dollars started to get exported. And this is the chart of the massive deficit. Debt allows dollars to come back to the US. Gold doesn't come back. Bitcoin has the same problem. Massive over leveraging systems leads to market crashes. So what he was talking about is, sort of the dollars are used around the world. We allow other countries to buy debt. So they buy our debt in dollars, but it comes back. So it's working pretty well. He kind of talked about Bitcoin and gold in that if you pay for things in gold, you're not going to get that back. If you pay for things in Bitcoin, you're not going to get that back either. So dollars are still working well, but at this point, we've massively over leveraged our systems, those systems that have been in place for the last 40, 50, 60 years, and now we're headed toward a market crash because of that. Talks about poverty and Americans struggling with poverty. The safety net in the United States is very weak, so most people don't have much money, and this is a big problem. Basically, now the boomers are retiring, consuming even more in their retirement years, and so the rest of us have to pick up the slack. I'm not quite a boomer. I'm a Gen Xer, I guess you could call me. And so what do we do? Do we pick the red pill or the blue pill? Red pill created tight monetary policy and raised rates, but that creates a rolling recession, wipes out the wealth of the boomers. Nobody wants that. They would get very upset. Or do you pick the blue pill and do the right thing? The right thing in quotes, which is modern monetary MMT. Sorry, I can't remember what the T stands for, but anyway. So basically what he thinks is the government debt will balloon and people will start complaining because, and when the boomers start complaining, they'll just print more money. And if this happens, they would change the Federal Reserve Act. Bonds will go to zero, and this will make people upset as well. So the government will buy the bonds out. This leads to massive inflation, and then the government will have to raise taxes like sales tax, property tax, income tax, and the Fed will raise rates at that point to get the money back and then destroy it basically. And now it's the case for gold and Bitcoin in his opinion. So he thinks this is leading to a lot of opportunity. It gives power back to the people. You're going to vote with your feet. We're going to vote with where you're going to put your money. If you're going to rely on dollars or you're going to buy gold and Bitcoin. And so that's going to cause the Congress to take over the Fed. And then they'll just give a blank check. He thinks so. Basically, the power will go from the Fed to the Congress, and then the government will control everything, in his opinion. And that's what's kind of coming. Which, real modern monetary theory has never been tried. And this is basically a false promise. Here's, according to the MMT, in a country that can print its own currency, the true constraint on spending is never the scale of the sovereign debt obligations, but only the pool of real resources. America cannot run out of dollars because it can print them It will therefore always be able to pay its debts. Further, Uncle Sam does not actually need to borrow money or raise taxes to increase public spending. The government can simply finance new outlays through money printing if the Federal Reserve is willing to let it. Thus, neither the absolute size of America's debt load nor the threat of bond vigilantes refusing to buy U.S. treasuries at affordable interest rates constrain the Congress's spending power. The real constraints do not exist in the realm of budgetary abstractions, but in that of material realities. So it's basically a theory not based in reality. So they're creating a new reality. Very, very crazy stuff. All right, the Fed then goes away when the Congress takes over, like I said. And so what's at stake is Biden decides whether to stick with Jerome Powell's federal. Oh, that's right. Yeah. So the three functions of money. So store value, unit of account, medium of exchange. So talked about Bitcoin isn't any of these yet, but it will be. It's durable. Bitcoin versus a cow. A cow can die. Portable, Bitcoin versus gold. Gold's not very portable. It's divisible. Gold is very hard to divide. So if you have a bar of gold, how do you, you get the idea. It's uniform. Bitcoin is uniform. It is fungible. There's a limited supply. There's only 21 million. And its acceptability is increasing all the time. So more and more people are recognizing it and accepting it. We will have to have a deflationary crash basically to get out of this. He recommends having a lot of cash. Things will get cheap. He's predicting this will happen in a year or two. Next person that was speaking is Brett Johnson. SantiagoCapital.com. He's the one that came up with the dollar milkshake theory. He thinks that capital will flow to the dollar. He thinks that monetary systems will die around the world. Everybody in the world is dealing with the same problems. But the big difference between every other currency and the dollar is that the dollar is the world currency and all debt is denominated in dollars. So he thinks that his the dollar milkshake theory is that as this shakes out, the dollar will win because all of the debt is denominated in dollars. So people would need dollars to satisfy the debt. Took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around that, but it is very fascinating. So he thinks the dollar and the value of gold will rise together. These are three books on psychology, and talks about how we're in a cognitive dissonance scenario right now in the government and basically the populations around the world. These books all talk about the wisdom of psychopaths, different stories about the psychology and what's happening right now. The 7 heads of the G7 nations. So these are kind of the leaders of the world. World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, the central planners, most of the people at rebel capitalists, most of us that stand for free market capitalism, see that basically the leaders of the world are all sort of in cohorts to control the monetary system. Trudeau, Macron, Biden, and some of the other leaders here. He calls them the 7 psychopaths. And The Wisdom of the Psychopaths is that one book. And Alan Harrington wrote in 1972, put forward a radical new theory on human evolution. Psychopaths constitute a dangerous new breed of Homo sapien, a psychological superhero free from the shackles of anxiety and remorse. So think about that. If you have a society or some leaders that have freed themselves of anxiety and remorse for what they're actually doing, the results of what their the results of their actions, then we lead down a really dangerous and scary path. They push the bond market, increase prices, causing alarms to go off all over the world. Central banks are having to react. Again, this is a common theme among all the people that spoke. So the cognitive dissonance is the criticism of the Fed. So as a result of that, the Fed stopped the QE and raised rates, which is exactly the opposite of what they should have done. But it's, again, these are psychopaths we're dealing with. In his opinion, if low rates is okay, then this should also be okay. Is what they're thinking. What does it mean to be convinced? So that's what's happening. Like, people are just convinced of this. One of the books that talks a lot about this, which I intend to read, is On Being Certain, one of those books that I showed earlier. Involuntary feelings, sort of, that we have. He talks about sort of the psychology of people and knowing or know nothing. Incognito bankers are leading, so you can't even see who they are. And really, it's like, is this accurate or not? You know, who are these people? What are they actually thinking? Why are they doing this? We don't know what's going to happen. We've never seen this before. The world leaders have never seen this before. It's, in my opinion, been a plan put in place since like 1971. They're kind of at the end of completing their plan. And so most leaders have never seen in the recent past no quantitative easing or rising rates. Like, just it hasn't been a thing for a long time. And now all of a sudden we're seeing the quantitative tightening and the lowering of the rates. And we don't have any experience with it. So the world leaders are kind of not dealing with it properly, in his opinion. We have the lowest rates ever in history, and he thinks they'll probably rise, but maybe not. Keep an open mind. The Japanese yen is down more than ever, broke a 40-year support, one of the most used currencies in the world. It affected the China yuan. If the Chinese currency is devalued, shocks will be through the entire world. And again, back to the dollar milkshake theory, this will set up the dollar for a major rise against all the other currencies. So it was a really interesting talk that he did. So this is one of the pictures he put up about the U.S. has tightest monetary policy, or relatively speaking, if you can believe that. The dollar bears, we're going to probably see a crisis. They will see a crisis, if they're bearish on the dollar. He thinks the dollar will go up, but ultimately down. They think it'll ultimately go down. He thinks it's going to go up as a result of this theory. And back to if you're convinced or not. So that's what people expect to see. So they're convinced it's going to happen. How does that affect us? How does that affect the world economy? I think we're about to see. Do you want to be informed or remain sane? My desire is to be well informed. My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. I could really resonate with that when I saw that. I had to take a picture of it. All right, I'm going to pause this. Okay, now next we have a panel. This is the first day, third panel, I believe. Anyway, so this panel was Brent, Robert Kiyosaki, Joseph Wang, and Stephen, who we just heard from. So they had a discussion about the argument for a dollar going down versus Brent Johnson saying the dollar is going up, the dollar milkshake theory. So they talked about the dollar relative to the euro. George says he thinks they will have to raise rates even more. And since 9/11, interest rates were lowered in the US for 6 to 7 years, but the other countries around the world didn't lower their interest rates. So they call the United States the dirtiest, dirty shirt, or cleanest dirty shirt during that time. I wrote that down wrong. It's still not great, but at least they were artificially low after 9/11, which was interesting. I had never thought about that compared to other interest rates around the world. So the Fed wants a higher dollar to get inflation under control domestically. Globally, the dollar is the most powerful weapon. If it goes up, it can destroy companies or countries around the world. If it goes up a lot, European countries, smaller countries for sure, can get destroyed because they won't be able to buy the dollars that they need to pay down their debt. A lot of these problems are going to have, we're going to start seeing, according to these guys. If you get them to pick a side, like the Russia example, for India to kind of support Russia by buying their oil, they had to pick a side. India is kind of neutral, right? But when these types of things happen, that's what countries are pushed to do. Another thing was like lockdowns. What do? You lock down, try to control the economy in that way. We've just seen that for the first time ever. So yeah, it can lead to really crazy things. IMF, they said, is controlled by the US. The EU is the bastard state of the United States. These are pretty crazy claims. They call it the Plaza Accord 2.0. The Plaza Accord, I had to look this up, was a 1985 agreement among the G5 nations, France, Germany, and the United States, United Kingdom, and Japan to manipulate exchange rates by depreciating the US dollar relative to the Japanese yen and the German Deutschmark. Pretty crazy. I didn't know that, but they think that's kind of what's happening now. This is kind of a 2.0 version of that. And so they talked about some ideas, bringing the dollar down, interest rate differentials, Fed backstopping debt, like we talked about earlier, swap lines and the return of quantitative easing, and just generally a global depression. These are some of the tools that they talked about could be used. So pretty crazy. Then on to Robert Kiyosaki was next. Always love to hear this guy. He was off the handle this time. He was really dramatic, I guess you would say, but still right along the same theme that he's always talked about. Financial advice for losers is go to school, get a job, work hard, pay taxes, save money, buy a house because your house is an asset. Get out of debt, invest for a long-term and well-diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and ETFs. He thinks all that is a load of crap. And if you do that, you're never going to get anywhere. Your house isn't an asset. I learned that from him years and years ago. It changed the way I started to think about everything. Robert Kiyosaki and Donald Trump have been working together for 10 years or more. They've written 2 books together. We talked a little bit about Donald Trump. Aside from political view, I know that's kind of a word that people get all crazy about, talking about Donald Trump, but he thought he would talk a little bit about from a business standpoint, and said that Donald's staff is amazing. Wanted to write these books because the middle class is disappearing, and talked a little bit about the problems that we're seeing now with energy, and how Biden closed the Keystone Pipeline, causing oil to go from $30 a barrel to $130 a barrel, just by doing something simple like that. He created the game called Rat Race. Is that what it's called? I think. But anyway, Maria Montessori is one of his kind of heroes, I guess you would say. And she always said that games are the best teachers. What the hand does, the mind remembers. Talked a lot about her. Here's an income statement. He said, this is your report card. Your report card from a college doesn't get you anywhere, but your income statement does. Your income statement, balance sheet, and your cash flow. And talked a lot about the blockchain and how this is kind of changing the way we look at everything from this perspective. He talked about, if you want an education, go collect rent. His rich dad had him go around the island of Hawaii to a bunch of his rental units and go to the door and knock on the door as a kid and collect rent. And he said, you'll hear every story imaginable when you do that. It's an education. And talked a lot about, being educated in a school versus going out and doing it. Cash flow is the board game. Sorry, not Rat Race. It's called, it's getting out of the Rat Race. Cash flow board game is a board game he created quite a while ago. And it helps you understand what a financial statement is. The more dangerous the mission, the more you have to prepare, is what he learned in the Marines, and indicated that we're headed toward a very dangerous time here. Was very enthusiastic about the outlook that he has. He thinks that more than ever, we need to get ourselves prepared for something that is coming that we've never seen before. And he was a Marine helicopter pilot. He got shot down, I think he said, handful of times. So because they knew they were going to get shot down, they would practice crashing the helicopter. Quite fascinating stories. He goes through kind of some of the history, the world, some leaders in history. Let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. Adolf Hitler, CRT, is what he referred to as what's happening right now. A heavy or progressive or graduated income tax is necessary for the proper development of communism. This was Karl Marx. Wants to tax us. Seems like what we're seeing as well. In his opinion, the press must grow day in and day out. It's our party's sharpest and most powerful weapon. Joseph Stalin. Think what we've been seeing in the press for the last couple of years. Pretty crazy. Voters decide nothing. Vote counters decide everything. Joseph Stalin. What's that remind you of? All political power comes from the barrel of a gun. The Communist Party must command all the guns. That way, no guns can ever be used to command the party. Mayo. He killed 60 million people. They talked about again, back to creating a tribe, a group, having a network of people around you. The collective is that group that I was talking about earlier, George Gaiman and Jason Hartman and Ken McElroy put together. Things like the Rebel Capitalist Live, he said, are just fantastic events to attend. That's why I do that. I try to learn as much as I can about what other experts are seeing and what is coming down the pike. That's why I feel economics, macroeconomics is super important to understand and learn about and see what's actually happening, because nothing happens quickly. So what I've seen is that if we can kind of get an idea of what the central planners or powers that be are thinking, that maybe we can prepare for it and be on the right side of a huge shift that we'll probably see in the near future. He recommends having a safe place, be armed, know how to fight. There's a Limitless Financial Freedom Expo that's coming up that he talked about. I don't know much about that. Most critical time in world history is now, he says. They created the Rich Dad House in DC to kind of talk to people in DC and try to get these politicians to see maybe back to the cognitive dissonance that may kind of persist there in DC. Says their mission is financial education. They're kind of co-branding in some aspects with other organizations. What they're doing in 2022, they're going to be at the Arizona State University. They're going to, there's going to be a live event there on February 8th of 2023. It's Robert, Dennis Prager, and Charlie Kirk. At Prager University, they're partnering up to do a gala, I think it is. This is the Rich Dad House in Washington, D.C. And then Ken McElroy and Robert talked about the velocity of money, talked about holding, rental properties. So Ken McElroy operates the Robert's real estate company, real estate holdings, basically. I don't think they're actually in business together. Robert just invests in Ken's deals, and talked about an interesting deal that they have going on. They're buying a gold mine, and actually today's the 12th of July. So I think this was on the 9th of July of 2022. This gold mine business corporation went public on the New York Stock Exchange. So they were pretty excited about that and talking a lot about that. All right. So on to Joseph Wang, thefedguy.com. So this guy has literally bought trillions of dollars worth of stuff in his career because he worked for the Federal Reserve. He had a lot to say about kind of commodities. He thinks that commodity prices will go up, and talked a little bit about how the powers that be want to kind of convert to a renewable resources, battery cars and things. So in his opinion, combustion cars will remain the main automobile because of the cost. So if you want to buy an electric car, that's great, and go buy one if you have the money. His point was, you're never going to be able to buy a reliable electric car for a few $1,000s. So because most people need to pay a few $1,000s, a lot of people do. I guess maybe not most people, but you're going to see that combustion vehicles are going to be maintained. And this chart kind of indicates the where we're headed to in terms of fuel consumption. We're leaving an easy money era, end of the easy money era, kind of. kind of peaked, and now we're, as you can see, really commodity. There's a downward trend, essentially, is what he was talking about. And the Fed is reacting to inflation by hiking short-term rents. Again, remember, he worked there. He understands kind of the way they think. And they're doing that to kind of increase the rate so that the demand will go down. So if you think about an auto loan, for example, that's going to get affected by these short-term rate increases. So if you want to go buy a car, you may think twice about it. So it might curb demand because your interest rate's going to be higher in your auto loan. He says there's going to be aggressive quantitative tightening that's coming to cause mortgage rates to go higher. They were spending $50 billion per month on quantitative tightening in 2018, and now it's up to $95 billion, and it's basically tripled. He expects it to not just double, but to triple. This will cause taxes to go higher, interest rates to go higher. The dollar will be stronger because other countries, like we talked about, borrow in dollars, not local currency. But the revenue is in the local currency, so it makes them hard to repay those dollar debts. So he expects the bond market to sell off. And as that happens, money goes into equity market. So the corporation and government sell the bonds, they buy stocks, and then they're going to kind of hike rates until something breaks, basically. That's what they've done in the past. He thinks it's different this time because they're fighting inflation unconditionally. So that's what they put out a message here. I guess it's in June of 2022. They put out a message that they're going to fight inflation unconditionally. So what he says that means is that they have new tools available to be able to do that have emerged over the last couple of years. They have tools like municipal lending fund. This is a new fund that they've created to lend to municipalities across the country. And so with that, they can tighten the monetary conditions when they lend these and lend them at higher rates. So it's all within the governments of the country. And he says now, and I think this is kind of related to that MMT philosophy that we talked about earlier. He wrote a book called Central Banking 101 that you can find on Amazon, and that was him. So I didn't take many notes apparently, but it was pretty short. Anyway, we're off to the next speaker with Jeff Snyder, AlhambraPartners.com. If you want to look him up, pretty fascinating economist, investor. And he talks about why the dollar remains king. Seems like a common theme here among these speakers. Money mysticism, 80% of all US dollars in existence were printed in the last 22 months, from 4 trillion in January 2020 to 20 trillion in October of 2021. Think about that for a second. That is pretty crazy. So he refers to it as money mysticism. And the Federal Reserve has, in the last 2 years, increased the money M1 money supply. So M1 money supply, from how I understand it, is the money supply in the government and the large financial institutions, and then it's transaction-based money, I guess you would say. The M2 money supply is the market. So M2, from the way I understand it, is, so this is all of the money in everybody's banking accounts, the citizens' banking accounts. It's money in the market that's moving around, corporations buying stocks, those sorts of things. That's M2 money supply. And then we talk about M3 here in a second. So people thought the dollar was going to crash. And then he talks a lot about something that most people don't talk about, and says that there's no correlation between Fed rates and the dollar rising or falling. This was kind of the theme of his entire presentation, which is kind of contrary to most people's thinking. And again, back to the cognitive dissonance in in the governments and in the people that have been the psychopaths basically controlling the world. I'll just say it. So he goes on to talk about foreign governments buying treasuries, and there's a direct correlation to the foreign governments to the global dollar shortage. And that he brings up kind of this theory of the case of the missing money. So where did all this money come from, and where did it all go? Here's a picture of the dollar, the Dixie they call it. So where we're at now, it's pretty low, but how does that correlate to the euro dollars outside of the control of the Fed? So we don't know how to measure M3, which is kind of the tertiary or the way that the banks lend to other banks. We just don't have any idea of how much that is, or how much is existence. And then euro dollar also, we don't really know how much of that is in existence. He talked about the myth of Paul Volcker. And the timeline, the Fed can do nothing but tell people what the interest rate is, and they have no idea about the central bank. So the only thing the Fed can do is talk about the interest rate. He said that basically we're seeing like the inflation, the perceived inflation of the dollar is kind of 98% talk. So it's credit markets. So after the great financial crisis in 2009, call it, the quantitative easing and trillions of created trillions in banks reserves. There was no QE before that, and so kind of his point was, it's all talk. There's no actual. There's the value of the dollar increasing is based on perception, not actual reality. And then he says 98% of all of this inflated inflation and everything else is basically all kind of creating a narrative is the way I understood it. He says that unemployment isn't a great resignation, it's because the economy hasn't recovered. So it's been artificially kind of strung along since the great financial crisis. So even though we've seen over the last, until recently, things doing pretty well, he thinks it's all artificially created based on a narrative. And talked a lot about the assets of the rest of the world versus the financial accounts of the US. Digital currency is not a store of value, but to create a new medium of exchange. Misconception is that first, this is a misconception first. There'll be a store of value, but in the long run, we're going to look back and see that crypto was at a bubble. And we're seeing now, this is, like I said, recording this on July 12th of 2022, we're seeing a huge correction in the market. Crypto prices, asset prices in general have tanked. We're in a recession area environment, I guess you could say. I don't know anybody that said we're definitely in a recession, officially, but if you look around, it looks a lot like it. So Jeff Snyder has a YouTube channel called Eurodollar University, if you want to check him out. And this is another graph of a little bit easier to read some of the stuff that he wrote up on here. He calls the last sort of since 2009 the silent depression. And all right, so on to the panel. All right, so this panel was Jeff, Joseph Wang, George Gaiman, and Brent as well. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the MC of the event is Robert Helms of the Real Estate Guys radio show. They put on lots of events. I've been to probably 6, 7, 8 of their syndication events. They're really great. If you ever are interested in learning about syndication, they're great. It's a great place to learn, but meet a lot of cool people. Anyway, the interest rate manipulation, changing markets, and how it affects the CPI, this Consumer Price Index. So Joseph said that in 2023, he thinks inflation will be around 5 to 6%. Jeff jokingly said, "Don't make predictions." Anyway, he looked at the demand and what things are in demand, what part of the markets are going to be inflated, and they talked a little bit about that. They weren't too sure, but you can kind of think about that for your own thought exercise. But the labor market has an effect on things. So labor supply issues around the world, Fed's out of the game, and now it's the government like in control, like we talked about. So I think the kind of common theme of the speakers was that the Fed has one tool, is to raise and lower interest rates. That's really all they can do. So there has to be other tools, and what the government's creating these other tools, like the CARES Act, for example. That was one big tool that they were able to put into effect that had a lot of other implications besides the stimulus, but primarily the stimulus. So kind of gets people used to free money. Going forward, I think you'll see universal basic income, UBI, will be more common. I'd be surprised if we didn't see something this year in 2022. So there's also going to be collateral constraints around the world that this causes based on stimulus money and things like that. Brent Johnson kind of ended with the point that what he's trying to do is just make it through the next 5 years. He thinks it's going to be really bad. He said he isn't going to try to get rich. If he does, great, but he's just going to try to survive. Pretty doom and gloom outlook, but yeah, that's kind of the theme of the whole thing. All right, finally, Doug Casey. Wow, what a character this guy was. He owns CaseyResearch.com, one of the most published financial authors in history. Fantastic mind, libertarian. He agrees that the Fed should be abolished. That was the first thing he came out with. He thinks they, historically speaking, and we saw this in George's actual presentation, that since they've been created, they created more harm than good for the country in general, not the central planners, but the country. He talks about how we have to look at history and how the Western civilization is collapsing, trans leaders, etc., people controlling the demand. The demented people controlling the demented president. Who are they? Pointed out the Bolsheviks, and in history, if you look at who they were, I don't know a lot about it, so I'm not going to claim to, but I wrote that down. I was going to actually research that a little bit. All right, here he goes into the 60s was an overture to the collapse of the West, attitudes, values, and virtues. These have been being destroyed since then. 12 things that make the West unique are being destroyed, he thought. He said free thought, political correction, and wokeness, free speech, cancel culture, and hate speech is now good, apparently, because you can see, who they are, fear of trifle, words important so that you know who they are. Anyway, I took some notes here. Some of them didn't make a lot of sense, and I couldn't remember exactly what he said. But anyway, you get the idea. He said another thing that makes the West unique is free markets. And he said this is think, speak, and then do. And then regulation as a result of this is socialism. Socialism is sort of making markets not free anymore, basically. He talked about relations and the democratism of relations. So basically, you get to choose if it's a democracy. There's sort of this cancel culture, I guess you'd say, what he was getting at, individualism replaced by identity politics. Reason is replaced by groupthink. It's a cult that affects the liberty, and it's dangerous because they can't control it. So basically, he said if it's a liberty is dangerous to the powers that be because they can't control it. Progress is considered dangerous. He expects it's accepted that no one should be left behind. This kind of controls free markets because there has to be competition for a free market to exist. But if you're I guess not leaving anybody behind, then you kind of destroy the free market. Privacy is replaced by transparency, government monitoring everything in your smartphone. Basically, anything you say or do, the government can see that. Property rights were one of the unique things that we used to have. Now you own nothing and you'll be happy, was what Klaus Schwab said. And a couple of years ago. So there will be a limited upper class as a result of this. You'll have free medications, so you'll have UBI, universal basic income. And you'll have the right to use these things if you're good and you comply with kind of what they want you to think and act. The rule of law was another one of these unique things that we used to have, and it's been replaced by thousands of micro rules. The great laws: do what you say, don't impose on other people's property. Kind of those are kind of a thing of the past, is what his point was. Industry and capitalism were another one of these unique things of the West. And if you have those now, you're considered to be greedy. Nature is not your friend. It wants to kill you. So this is something that he, these are some radical points that he kind of wanted to demonstrate. It's up to you whether you agree with them or not. And he said there's 12 fruits of the Western civilization, and literature was replaced by the internet. Music was replaced by found language. included in music. He was talking about some of the rap music that's out there. Art is replaced by NFTs. And okay, I had to pause it there for a second. So we were talking about, basically he was talking about how things are really being changed from what they used to be to what they are now. He thinks that what could happen is a breakdown of civilization, like Sri Lanka, Haiti, Ukraine. Just the simple fact that people don't understand the fundamentals of where food comes from could cause some major problems if there is a food shortage. He thinks that there's quite possibly an overthrow of the civilized world. Thinking the Unthinkable is a book that he recommended by Herman. Industrial and agriculture are two major things in history. And when he was talking about what happens if those two things start to collapse, really it's like an economic collapse is next. What he looked at as a positive that could come from this after this next phase was the next generation could reach singularity. We could have space travel, nanotechnology. He thinks is something that we're going to see in not too distant future. What you can do, he recommended allocating capital wisely, be a speculator. He's one of the best speculators ever in terms of an investor. Save in good currencies. Be an investor. You're going to be forced to be a speculator, positioned to take advantage of the distortion of capital caused by governments. And he's a fan of gold. Somebody asked him if what he thought about gold. He keeps it as an insurance. He recommended looking at mining stocks, gold mining, and he expects there to be an explosion of stocks, explosion of the mining stocks. He thinks that stocks in general are volatile, and they are probably cheap right now. That was his outlook. And that concluded the conference. So hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for watching.